Example 2, using the square root property. We want to solve each quadratic equation. The first quadratic equation that we have is x squared equals 17. So I'm going to write that here. We have x squared is equal to 17. Okay, so when we're using the square root property, what we need to do is we need to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to take the square root of the left side, which is the square root now of x squared, and that's going to equal the square root of 17. Now, when we take the square root of a number, we got to make sure that we say plus or minus. Because of the fact that this is a number, and this gives us a value of plus or minus of that particular value. Okay, so now what we want to do is then find out, what do I need to square to get x squared? Well, we know that that's going to give us x. Over here, we have the answer plus or minus the square root of 17. So now we have our two solutions. Now recall, there's two ways to write this. The first one is that we have the negative square root of 17 and then positive square root of 17. Or we can write it in a more simplified version by plus or minus the square root of 17. Now, the reason why we didn't simplify this any further is because 17 is a prime number, so we don't need to go anywhere further with that. Okay, now let's move on to the next example. Here we have x squared equals negative 25. So let's go ahead and write that out. So we have x squared, which is equal to negative 25. Okay, so just like we did in the previous example, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we have the square root of x squared, and that's equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 25. Now, we know that the square root of x squared, meaning what do I have to square to get x squared, our result is x, plus or minus. Now, if you notice, we have a negative under the radical sign. So that tells us that we're going to have a pure imaginary solution, which means that we need to factor out the square root of negative 1. So we have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Okay, so what do we know about that? Well, we know that it's going to be plus or minus. We know that the square root of negative 1 is I. And then what do I need to square to get 25? Well, the answer is 5. Now, we're not going to leave it that way. We want to write it in this form where it's plus or minus 5i. So therefore, we have our two solutions. These are imaginary solutions. So again, the longer version is to write negative 5i and then positive 5i, or the simplified version where it's plus or minus 5i. Next, we want to solve this quadratic equation. So here we have x minus 4 squared, and that is equal to 12. Okay, so we're going to follow the same procedure using the square root property. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to take the square root of x minus 4 squared, and that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of 12. Okay, so what do I need to square to get x minus 4 squared? Well, we know that that result is going to give us x minus 4. And that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of 12. Now, there's two ways to simplify the square root of 12. Okay, and I'm going to show you both ways. Okay, so when we look at the value of 12, okay, we can first figure out what are factors of 12, meaning that is there a perfect square that we can multiply to get 12? Well, that means that we can take the value of 4 and then multiply it by 3, since 4 is a perfect square. That means that we can factor out the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, and therefore that gives us 2 times the square root of 3. Okay. Another way is to write the prime factorization of 12. The prime factorization of 12 is finding the factors of 12. So we know that 2 times 6 gives us 12. We know that 6 is a prime number. We can still break down 6 to be 2 times 3. And so therefore, this is actually 2 times 2 times 3. Or we can write this as 2 squared times 3. So then we're going to replace the 12 to be 2 squared times 3. And then we're going to factor out the 2 squared and then factor out the 3. And so then we would ask ourselves, what do we need to then square to get 2 squared? Well, that answer gives us 2 times the square root of 3. Now, in this case, the first one is a lot easier because this number is smaller, 12, right? And that gives us an easy number to figure out what the perfect square is. But then if we end up with a larger number, and let's say it's like, 162, well, we're not going to know exactly what that perfect square is. So when you break it down like this, it's going to make it easier to be able to simplify. So now let's go back. So now we got plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. Now the next thing is we need to solve for x. So we're going to have to add 4 to both sides. But keep in mind that the 4 has to be in front of the plus or minus, not after that radical. And so therefore we're going to get the following. We're going to get x, which is going to equal positive 4 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. So again, as I stated, there's two ways to write this answer. The first one is we got 4 minus 2 times the square root of 3, and then 4 plus 2 times the square root of 3. And then again, the simplified version is going to be 4 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3.